Theodora Chandler drove the last fence post into the ground at a slight angle, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, and smiled like a woman who had just done something terribly, wonderfully wrong on purpose. It was the spring of 1882, and the land outside of Millhaven, Texas, was the kind of beautiful that made a person forget how hard it was to survive there. The rolling plains stretched in every direction, golden with buffalo grass and dotted with scrub oak, and the sky above was enormous and endlessly blue, the sort of sky that made a person feel small in the best possible way. Theodora had arrived in Millhaven 6 months prior, following the death of her father, Jonas Chandler, who had left her a modest 40-acre parcel along the eastern edge of the valley. It was not rich land. It had a creek that ran thin in summer, a barn that needed new boards along its southern face, and a farmhouse that leaked when the wind came from the northwest. But it was hers, entirely and completely hers, and that fact alone made Theodora love every crooked inch of it. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept in a practical braid that still managed to come loose by midday, and brown eyes that were several shades too warm to be called serious, though she was, in fact, a very serious woman. She had come from Galveston, where she had spent the better part of her life keeping her father's accounts and managing his feed store, and she knew the difference between a fence post set at 80 degrees and one set at 90, because she had helped build enough of them growing up to know it mattered, which was precisely why the fence she was building along the northern edge of her property was such a masterpiece of deliberate imperfection. The posts leaned, not catastrophically, not so much that any passing stranger would gasp, but enough that the wire she strung between them would sag in places and pull at odd angles, enough that the gate she hung at the center of the run would refuse to latch properly no matter how many times she adjusted it. She had measured it all out the night before, lying in her father's old bed and staring at the ceiling, working through the geometry of it with the focused attention of a woman who had been thinking about her neighbor for exactly 4 months and 11 days. Dexter Thatcher. She had seen him first on a cold morning in November, when she had stepped out onto her porch to find a stray calf standing in her front yard, looking confused and vaguely apologetic. Dexter had come riding up the road 15 minutes later on a big gray horse named Copperhead, his hat pushed back on his head, and his expression carrying that particular combination of mild embarrassment and easy confidence that Theodora had found immediately insufferable and almost immediately irresistible. He had tipped his hat, thanked her for not chasing the calf off, lifted the animal across his saddle as if it weighed nothing, and ridden back the way he had come. She had watched him go until he disappeared over the low rise that separated their properties, and then she had gone back inside and sat at her kitchen table for a full 10 minutes before she remembered she had been meaning to make coffee. His ranch was called the Double T, and it ran along the northern edge of her property for a quarter mile. He raised cattle and horses both, and he did it with a crew of 3 men she had come to know by sight over the winter. There was Old Pete, who drove the supply wagon into Millhaven every other Thursday and always tipped his hat to her if they crossed paths. There was a young man named Carlos, who could not have been more than 20 and who worked with an intensity that suggested he was trying to prove something important. And there was a broad-shouldered man named Amos, who Theodora suspected did most of the heavy lifting and very little of the talking. Dexter himself was 30 years old, tall in the particular way that ranchers often were, with the kind of physical presence that came not from vanity but from years of hard and necessary labor. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that were, in Theodora's private assessment, absolutely unfair. He had a scar along his jaw that she had noticed on the second time she saw him, at the general store in Millhaven, where they had both reached for the same tin of coffee at almost the same moment, and she had pulled her hand back as if burned. He had laughed, low and quiet, and handed her the tin, and said he preferred tea anyway, which she had not believed for a single second. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times over the winter. Brief conversations. The kind that happened between neighbors when they encountered each other on the road, or at the post office, or at the small Methodist church that Theodora attended irregularly, and Dexter apparently attended with greater devotion than she would have guessed from looking at him. Each conversation had ended slightly too soon. Each one had left Theodora with the unsatisfying sense that something had been left unfinished, like a sentence that stopped just before the word that mattered most. He had never found a reason to come to her property. She had never quite found a reason to go to his. And so, standing in the thin April sunshine with her hammer in her hand and her fence listing gently to the north like a row of small, uncertain soldiers, Theodora Chandler decided to manufacture a reason. She finished the last section of fencing by late afternoon, stepped back to survey her work, and felt a deep and profound satisfaction at how thoroughly mediocre it was. The wire was strung, but it would not hold a determined goat, let alone the kind of cattle that the double T ran along the valley floor. The gate hung at an angle that suggested it had given up entirely on the concept of closing. 3 of the posts had a lean to them that was noticeable if you were standing at the right distance and the light was right. Theodora went inside, washed her face, changed her shirt, and made supper. She waited 3 days. She was not a patient woman by nature, but she understood strategy, and she understood that patience was simply strategy applied over time. She went about her routines. She planted the kitchen garden behind the house, turning the soil with a spade, and setting out the seed packets she had ordered from the catalog in careful rows. She repaired the loose boards on the barn's southern face herself, driving the nails with confidence and a certain amount of private resentment that she could build the barn perfectly fine, but had chosen to bungle the fence. She rode into Millhaven on Tuesday for flour and salt and a new length of rope, and she exchanged pleasantries with the postmistress, a cheerful woman named Agnes Webb who seemed to know everything about everyone within 20 miles. "Heard you've been doing some fencing," Agnes remarked, handing over a small envelope that turned out to be a letter from Theodora's cousin in Houston. Theodora raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast. Carlos Martinez was in here Monday. Said he noticed your fence posts from the ridge when he was moving cattle." Theodora filed this information away with the focused calm of a card player who had just been dealt exactly what she needed. She thanked Agnes, tucked the letter into her coat pocket, and rode home with the particular composure of a woman who was trying very hard not to look pleased with herself. He came on the 4th day. She heard Copperhead before she saw Dexter, the gray horse's hooves distinctive on the packed dirt of the road that ran along the property line, and she forced herself to keep doing what she was doing, which was sitting on the porch steps sorting dried beans into a tin bowl. It required no real attention whatsoever, which meant she had to work considerably harder at appearing as though it did. The sound of hoofbeats slowed, stopped, and then she heard the creak of a saddle as someone dismounted, and then footsteps crossing the dry grass toward her. "Morning," Dexter Thatcher said. He was standing at the edge of her yard with his hat in his hand, which told Theodora he was making a social call rather than just passing. His gray eyes moved from her to the fence and back, and there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested he was trying very hard not to comment on what he had seen. "Good morning," Theodora said, as though she had not been listening for him for 3 days. "Something I can help you with." He settled his hat back on his head, and she could see him choosing his words with some care. "I was out riding the northern fence line this morning, and I couldn't help but notice your posts have come in a little." He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. "Irregular." Theodora looked up from her beans with an expression of innocent concern that she had practiced twice in the small mirror above her washstand. "Have they? I thought I set them plumb." He pressed his lips together briefly, and she got the distinct impression he was suppressing a great many things. "Not entirely, no. The wire's going to give you trouble come summer when you want to keep any stock in. I've got a level and a come-along at the ranch if you'd like some help straightening them out." "I wouldn't want to trouble you," Theodora said. "It's no trouble." He said it simply, without flourish, and she believed him entirely, and that made it worse. "Well," she said, setting her bowl of beans on the step beside her and rising, "if you're sure." He was sure. They worked through the morning, Dexter digging out the leaning posts with a patience and thoroughness that was quietly impressive, resetting them straight while Theodora held the level and pretended she had not known exactly what the correct reading should look like. He did not make her feel foolish. He explained what he was doing as he worked, not in the way of a man who assumes a woman cannot understand, but in the way of a person who simply enjoys talking about something they know well. And she found herself listening with a genuine attention that had nothing to do with the fence. He told her that the soil along the northern run had more clay in it than she probably expected, which made the posts settle differently than they would in sandier ground. He told her that the wire she had chosen was good gauge, good quality, that she had picked well at the hardware store, though he was curious where she had learned to string it. She told him that her father had taught her, and something in the way she said it made him look at her for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "He passed recently," Dexter asked, pulling the wire taut with the come-along and locking it off. "Last September," Theodora said. "He left me this place. I've been helping him with his business in Galveston since I was old enough to carry a ledger book, so I know how to manage accounts and orders and all of that, but the ranching side is—" She stopped. "New," he offered. "New," she agreed. "I've been at it since I was 12, he said, driving a staple into the post with 3 clean strikes of the hammer. "Still learning." She glanced at him. "How?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He did not give her a quick answer. "The land changes every year. The cattle change, you change, so there's always something new to understand." He drove another staple. "My father ranched this land before me, left it to me when he died 5 years ago. I thought I knew everything he'd taught me and then spent the next year discovering how much I didn't know." "How many acres?" Theodora asked. 220. He said it without pride and without apology, the way a person states a fact about the weather. "It was bigger once. My father sold off the eastern section years back during the hard winter of '72. She remembered reading about the winter of 1872 in the papers, though she had been 16 then and living in Galveston, where hard winters meant something considerably less severe than what they meant on the open plains. "That was a terrible year," she said. "It was," he agreed simply. They worked until just past noon, and by the time they were done, the fence line ran straight and true along the northern edge of her property, the posts plumb and the wire singing tightly between them. Theodora stood back and looked at it with the genuinely mixed feelings of a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted and lost the thing she had wanted it for. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it more than she could easily say. Dexter coiled the remaining wire back onto the spool with practiced efficiency and tucked his tools into the leather bag hanging from Copperhead's saddle. "Happy to help," he said. Then, with what she could see cost him a small but real effort, "It's good to have a neighbor. Previous owner of your place, old man, Cutter, he didn't much care for company." "I like company," Theodora said. His gray eyes met hers over the saddle, and something passed between them that neither of them named, because it was the first day of something and neither of them was ready to be reckless with it. "Good," he said. He mounted Copperhead, settled into the saddle, and looked down at her from that considerable height. "I'll be in Millhaven on Friday if you need anything brought back." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He rode back the way he had come, and Theodora stood in the yard and watched him go until he was over the rise, and then she sat down in the grass right where she was standing and looked up at the enormous blue Texas sky and felt something bright and precarious and entirely welcome opening up somewhere in her chest. She had planned it as a trick. She had not planned on liking him quite so sincerely and quite so quickly. She went into Millhaven on Friday, not because she needed anything brought back, but because she wanted to. She did not admit this to herself until she was already on her horse and halfway to town. The town of Millhaven was not large. It had a main street with a general store, a hardware store, a barber shop, a post office, a livery stable, a doctor's office that was also occasionally a dentist's office depending on the day, a two-story hotel that served food in its ground-floor dining room, the Methodist church at the eastern end, and 3 saloons arranged along the western end with the democratic optimism of establishments that believed there was enough business for all of them. It had a population of perhaps 400 people, and like all small towns, it had a memory that extended in every direction and a capacity for minding other people's affairs that Theodora was beginning to respect as a kind of civic art form. She found Dexter at the hardware store, loading a paper-wrapped bundle of something into his saddlebags and talking to the hardware store owner, a compact red-faced man named Brinkley who had strong opinions about fencing wire that he shared with anyone who gave him the opportunity. Dexter saw her come in and something in his posture shifted, not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention, but Theodora was paying attention. "Miss Chandler," he said. He had, she noticed, switched from her full name to the shorter address without announcing it, which she took as a positive development. "Mr. Thatcher," she replied. "Did Brinkley talk you into the heavier gauge again?" Brinkley looked delighted at this. "She's heard my speech," he said. "I've heard your speech," Dexter confirmed to Theodora, with that quiet low note in his voice that she was beginning to understand was his version of amusement. "He gives it to everyone with a fence." "That's because everyone with a fence needs to hear it," Brinkley said, entirely unabashed. Theodora bought the things she needed, which were genuinely needed and which she had not manufactured the need for. And when she came back out onto the street, Dexter was waiting, though he was making it look as though he was simply standing on the boardwalk and thinking about nothing in particular. She decided to be merciful and not point this out. "Are you heading back now?" he asked. "I thought I might have dinner at the hotel first," she said. "Their chicken on Fridays is supposed to be decent." "It is," he said. "I've eaten there." "Is that an offer to join me?" Theodora asked because she had gotten tired of waiting for him to get there himself. The look that crossed his face was brief and interesting, a flash of something that might have been startlement and might have been relief. "It is," he said. "If that's agreeable, I wouldn't have asked if it wasn't." They sat across from each other at one of the 4 tables in the hotel dining room, and they talked for 2 hours over chicken and boiled potatoes and very bad coffee, and it was the finest 2 hours Theodora had spent since arriving in Millhaven. She told him about growing up in Galveston, about her father's feed store, and the way the salt air came off the Gulf in the mornings, about the cousins she had in Houston and the one in New Orleans who wrote letters that were entertaining in the way that slightly scandalous things always were. He told her about growing up on the Double T, about his father teaching him to read cattle the way other men's fathers taught them to read books, about the years he had spent as a young man driving cattle up through the territory before he came back to take over the ranch. He told her about a winter 3 years back when he had lost a third of his herd to a fever that swept through the valley, and how it had taken him 2 full seasons to rebuild the numbers. She told him she had been engaged once, briefly, to a man in Galveston who had turned out to want a bookkeeper for his shipping business more than he had wanted a wife. Dexter listened to this without comment, but his gray eyes were attentive in a way that made her feel the information had been properly received and filed. He did not offer anything equivalent in return, which she noted but did not press. There were things a person would get to in their own time, and she had learned early enough that pushing before the time was right was the surest way to make a person close up like a hand around a held card. When they stepped back out onto the main street, the afternoon was getting long and golden, the shadows stretching east, and the air had the particular quality it got in the Texas spring when the wind came soft and warm from the south and everything smelled like grass and possibility. Dexter walked her to where she had tied her horse, a steady bay mare named Clover, and untied her while Theodora pulled on her riding gloves. "I'll see you back safely," he said. "I'm perfectly capable of riding home alone," she told him. "I know you are," he said. "I'd like to see you home anyway." She considered this for a moment, looking at him over Clover's neck, and decided that some things were worth not arguing about. "All right," she said. They rode back along the valley road as the sun went low, and they talked and sometimes did not talk, and both the talking and the silence were equally comfortable, which Theodora thought was one of the finest things you could discover about a person. She showed him the places along her land where she was thinking of putting in a kitchen garden on the east side as well, and he told her she would get better drainage there than on the west, which she had already suspected, but was pleased to have confirmed. When they reached the turnoff that led to her house, he slowed Copperhead and she pulled Clover to a stop. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said, and there it was again, that directness that was becoming her favorite thing about him. "I'll ask again sometime," she offered. "I hope you will," he said. He waited at the turnoff until she had reached her front door, then touched his hat brim once, wheeled Copperhead around and rode north. Theodora went inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen for a full minute, doing nothing, just standing in the warm, particular stillness of a feeling that was growing fast and strong, and a little terrifying. The spring moved on in the way that springs do in Texas, with wild swings between warmth and a lingering cold that could not decide whether it was done yet. And over the weeks that followed, the distance between Theodora and Dexter shortened by degrees that were small but accumulating. He stopped by her property twice more on legitimate business, once to let her know that a section of the fence line they shared along the western edge had a post that had heaved with the frost, and she should know before her horses got ideas, and once to bring back a package from Millhaven that had arrived at the post office in her name when he happened to be there. Both times he stayed longer than the errand required. Both times the conversation ran easily and into territory that was not purely neighborly. She went to the Double T once, to return a tool she had borrowed, a fence pliers with the Double T brand burned into the handle that she suspected he had left at her place semi-intentionally, and she spent half an hour in the ranch yard talking to Carlos and old Pete, while Dexter finished what he was doing inside the barn. When he came out wiping his hands on a cloth, he had a smear of axle grease along his forearm and a look on his face when he saw her that he got covered up quickly but not quite quickly enough. She liked him. She liked him with an honest and uncomplicated intensity that was new to her, because what she had felt for the man in Galveston had been something else entirely, something that had felt like, and turned out on examination to be mostly loneliness and proximity, and a certain convenient compatibility of circumstance. What she felt for Dexter Thatcher was different in kind. It was warmer and more unsettling, and significantly more difficult to set aside at the end of the day. The trouble was that he was careful. She understood this. She did not resent it, because she could see what was underneath the carefulness, could see it in those moments when his guard came down a fraction, when he laughed at something she said and forgot briefly to put the wall back up, when their hands accidentally overlapped reaching for the same thing, and he went still for a half-second before stepping back. He had been hurt, she suspected, though she did not know the particulars, and a person who had been hurt learned to move slowly through the territory that scared them most. She had patience. She had the fence to prove it. In May, the preacher's wife organized a community supper in the churchyard, which was a Millhaven tradition going back to before the town had a proper church, when it had been held under an oak tree with 4 families and a fiddle player. By 1882, it had grown to include most of the county and a considerable spread of food that suggested the women of Millhaven had been competing with each other since approximately 1869. Theodora brought her grandmother's corn pudding, which was richer and better than it had any right to be given how simple the ingredients were, and she arrived to find Dexter already there, standing at the edge of the gathering with a tin cup of lemonade, and a tolerant expression that suggested he had attended this event many times before and had made his peace with the fiddle. The fiddle player, a 60-year-old man named Henderson who had probably been playing since before the town existed, had strong feelings about the tempo of his music and did not allow anyone else to have strong feelings about it. The dancing that resulted from Henderson's playing was energetic and slightly chaotic, and it was into this atmosphere that Theodora arrived with her corn pudding and found Dexter watching the proceedings with the specific fondness of someone who had given up trying to change things they could not change. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, appearing at his elbow. He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. "I enjoy watching other people enjoy themselves," he said, which she filed alongside everything else she was collecting about him. They ate together, which happened naturally enough that it did not seem like a decision so much as an inevitability, and she introduced him to her corn pudding, which he ate 2 servings of with the honest appreciation of a man who was not performing anything. The evening lightened and warmed, and the fiddle played, and Henderson refused to slow down for anyone, and when someone pulled Theodora into the dancing she went, laughing, and danced 3 rounds with various partners before she found herself coming back to where Dexter was standing and saying, without quite planning to, "Are you going to stand there all night?" He looked at the dancers, then at her, and she could see him weighing something. "I'm not much of a dancer," he said. "Neither is Henderson's fiddle," she told him, "and it's out there anyway." Something shifted in his expression, and it was the kind of shift that preceded surrender, the kind that a person did not allow unless they trusted the person they were surrendering to. "All right," he said, setting his cup down. He was, in fact, not much of a dancer in the technical sense, but he was steady and present, and he paid attention to her in the way that mattered. And Theodora decided that dancing with Dexter Thatcher in the Texas spring, with Henderson's fiddle playing something that might have been a reel, was one of the better things that had happened to her in recent memory. He held her hand with a careful firmness, and when the dance brought them close, she could feel the warmth of him and the steadiness that was his most fundamental quality, the sense of a person who had been tested and held. When the song ended, he did not immediately step back. For a moment they were standing closer than dancing required, and his gray eyes were on hers with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 3 seconds before he stepped back and cleared his throat and said, "You were right about Henderson." "Was I?" Theodora said as calmly as she could manage. "He has no interest in tempo," Dexter said, "but he commits entirely to what he's doing, and there's something to be said for that." She looked at him. "There is," she agreed. The following week, on a Thursday, she rode over to the Double T with a jar of the corn pudding she had made again, and this time had no excuse for it at all. She knocked on the front door of the ranch house, which was a solidly built 2-story structure that showed the marks of care and also the marks of a man living alone for some time, and Dexter opened the door with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and flour on his hands, which surprised her so completely that she simply stared for a moment. "You bake," she said. He looked at his hands as though mildly surprised to find the evidence there. "I try," he said. "Pete usually does the cooking when he's around, but he's in Millhaven today." He held the door open. "Come in. Whatever you've brought smells better than what I've got in the oven." The inside of the house was what she had expected from the outside, and slightly more than that. A main room with a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, bookshelves along the east wall that held a genuine and somewhat surprising number of books, a braided rug that was showing its age, and in the kitchen, a cast-iron stove over which something that might have been biscuits was in the process of becoming something else. He saw her looking at the bookshelves. "My father was a reader," he said, pulling on a cloth and opening the oven. "He brought most of them from Virginia when he came out here. I've added some." She crossed to the shelves and looked at the spines while he dealt with the oven. There was a Bible much used. There was a full run of Shakespeare in small volumes with cracked spines. There was a shelf of what appeared to be agricultural texts, and one book about horse breeding that was so thoroughly annotated in the margins that it might have been a different book entirely. There was Dickens, all of it. There were maps, folded and tucked between the books at intervals. There was a volume of poetry that had a strip of leather marking a page toward the middle. "Which is your favorite?" she asked. "Of the books?" "Yes." He came to stand beside her, and she was aware of him the way you are aware of heat when you are cold, that particular attention your body pays to warmth. He reached past her and pulled out the Shakespeare, the slim volume of The Tempest. "This one," he said. "My father used to read it aloud in the evenings when I was a boy. I've read it so many times I could probably recite most of it." She took the book from him and held it for a moment. It was warm from the shelf. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," she quoted without thinking. He was quiet for a moment. "You know it," he said. "My father had the same volume." She handed it back, and their fingers overlapped in the exchange, and neither of them pulled away immediately, and it was Theodora who finally moved first, because she had decided some time ago that she was done with waiting to see if he would move. She looked up at him, and she was direct, because she was always direct, because she had learned that directness was the only thing that had ever gotten her anywhere worth going. "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said very quietly. "I like you," she said. "I want to be clear about that." Something happened to his expression that she could not immediately catalog, something complex and careful, and underneath it something that was not careful at all. "Theodora," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he had said it before. It landed differently, it meant more. "You do not have to say anything right now," she continued. "I just thought you should know in case you were uncertain." "I was not uncertain," he said. "About you." "I was uncertain about—" He stopped, looked at the book still in his hand, set it back on the shelf with the precision of a man who needed a moment to organize himself. "I was engaged once. 4 years ago. She was a woman from San Antonio who I had known for 2 years, and I thought I knew her, and it turned out that what she knew about me was primarily that I owned 220 acres of good land." He said it without bitterness, which was more difficult than saying it with bitterness would have been. "She left for a man in Denver, which was her right, but it changed how I trusted my own judgment about people." Theodora was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "And now?" she asked. "And now I trust my judgment again," he said, and he looked at her with those gray eyes fully open, nothing held back, and she felt the full weight of what he was giving her in the clarity of that look. "My judgment says you are the most capable and confounding and interesting person I have met in a very long time." "Confounding," she repeated. "The fence," he said simply. Her heart stopped. "I'm sorry. The fence," he said again, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that she had been cataloging for weeks as a suppressed smile, only now it was not suppressed at all. "I grew up building fences, Theodora. I can read the work, and those posts did not go in like mistakes." She stared at him. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the spring afternoon was pouring through the south window, and she could hear the cattle somewhere in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a ranch continuing about its business, and she felt a warmth rising in her face that she was completely unable to prevent. "I may have set them at a slightly suboptimal angle," she said. "Suboptimal," he said, deliberately. "Yes," he said, "I know." "And you came anyway," she said. "I had been looking for a reason for 4 months," he told her, and said it simply, as though it were nothing at all, as though the admission cost him nothing, and she understood that it cost him everything and he had chosen to pay it. "You saved me the trouble of inventing one myself." The laugh that came out of her was genuine and entirely undignified, and she put her hand over her mouth, and he laughed too, quietly, and the kitchen in the Double T Ranch house was full of the sound of 2 people discovering that they had been thinking the same thing from opposite sides of a fence for months, and the relief of that discovery was profound. She lowered her hand. "So you knew," she said. "I suspected," he corrected. "It became certainty when you held the level and pretended you didn't know which way it needed to go." "I was very convincing," she said. "You were not convincing at all," he said, "and it was the best morning I'd had all year." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, Are you going to do something about this, Dexter Thatcher, or are we going to spend the next 4 months circling around each other some more?" He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back behind her ear, a gesture so careful and deliberate and gentle that it landed somewhere important, and then he said, "I would like to call on you properly if that's agreeable." "It is very agreeable," she said. The biscuits burned. Neither of them noticed for several minutes. The summer of 1882 was hot and dry the way Texas summers always were, the sky bleaching pale and the creek running thin, and the whole landscape settling into the particular determined endurance that was the only appropriate response to a Texas July. Theodora worked her land through the heat with the same focused stubbornness she applied to everything, and Dexter called on her twice a week without fail, riding down from the double T in the evenings when the day's work was done. And she made coffee or lemonade depending on the temperature, and they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table or walked the property in the cooling dusk, and they talked and talked and talked some more. She learned him in the way you learn a landscape you intend to live in, not just the features but the weather, the quality of light, the way it changed through the seasons. She learned that he had a habit of going quiet when something troubled him that was not the same as his ordinary comfortable quiet, and that if she did not push but simply stayed present, he would come to the thing eventually on his own terms. She learned that he had an excellent and dry sense of humor that did not announce itself, but simply appeared when you least expected it, and that he was funnier than he appeared and smarter than he let on in company, and more tender than either of those things. She learned that he had a genuine love for his land that went beyond the practical, that when he talked about the double T, there was something in his voice that was close to the way some people talked about family, which she understood and recognized because she was beginning to feel the same way about her own 40 acres. He learned her in return. He learned that she was most honest in the mornings and most guarded in the evenings, which was the opposite of what he expected, and he adjusted without being asked. He learned that she had opinions about nearly everything, and enjoyed arguing about the things that were genuinely arguable, and had no patience for argument about the things she had already established as facts, and that the line between those two categories was clearer in her mind than it was to anyone else, but that she was usually right. He learned that she was funny and did know it, which was different from him being funny and not knowing it, and that her humor was sharper and quicker, and she aimed it with precision. He brought her things, not expensive things because expense was not the point, but considered things. A book he thought she would like, a volume of natural history that had good illustrations and excellent text about the flora of the Texas plains, seeds for a variety that of pepper she had mentioned wanting, a pair of leather-work gloves that fit her hands properly, because he had noticed her other pair did not and had asked, when in Millhaven, for a pair made for smaller hands. She received all of these things with the directness she applied to everything, without elaborate performance of gratitude, but with a sincere acknowledgement that meant more than performance would have. In July she helped him during the branding, which was not the kind of thing a neighbor's lady friend was expected to do, and which she simply did anyway because there were 4 of them and the work went faster with 5. She worked the chute gate with a reliability that earned her a look from old Pete that she interpreted correctly as the highest form of approval he was likely to offer, and Carlos called her Miss Chandler, with a respect that was genuine and slightly formal in the way of a young man who has been raised with good manners. Amos said nothing, as was apparently his custom, but at the end of the day he handed her the best tin cup of water she had ever tasted, and that seemed to mean something. Dexter watched her work his land and looked at her as though he could not entirely believe she was real, and she caught him doing it twice, and both times led him without comment. On a hot Sunday in August, they rode together out to the creek that ran along the back of both properties, where a stand of cottonwood trees made a rare shade, and they sat on the creek bank in the afternoon, and she had brought a cloth full of cold biscuits and peaches from the tree She was trying to coax back to health behind her barn, and he had brought a jar of sweet tea that Pete had made before heading into Millhaven for his day off. They ate with their feet near the water and the cottonwood leaves making their particular papery sound in the hot breeze, and Theodora looked out at the water running slow and clear over the limestone bed of the creek, and felt a contentment so complete it was almost alarming. "I have something to tell you," Dexter said, which made her turn to look at him, because his tone had that quality it got when he was approaching something from a careful distance. "Tell me," she said. He was looking at the water. "My father's land, the part he sold in '72, the eastern section. I've been in correspondence with the current owner, a man named Alderman who's been running sheep on it and not doing well. He wants to sell. The price is something I could manage if I took out a loan against the ranch." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. "I've been uncertain about the risk of it, taking on debt." "How much additional land?" she asked. 80 acres. Some of it rough, but some of it is good bottomland." "Would the bottomland support more cattle?" "Yes, enough that by the third year the income would more than cover the loan payments." She thought about this, doing the arithmetic in her head the way she had been doing arithmetic since she was old enough to manage her father's books. "If you have a bad year between now and year 3, that's the risk," he said. "One bad year and the timing gets tight. Could you sell off part of the herd if you needed liquidity in a bad year?" He looked at her and she could see him recalibrating something. "Yes, I'd lose ground on the rebuild, but it wouldn't sink me." "Then the risk is managed," she said. "You should buy the land." He was quiet for a moment. "You did that very quickly," he said. "I kept accounts for a feed store for 8 years, she said. "I know how to read the numbers." "The numbers," he said, and there was something in his voice, something careful and deliberate. "And what about the other part of it?" She looked at him steadily. "What other part?" He put the stone down and turned to face her fully, and his gray eyes were direct and serious and entirely open in the way they were when he had decided to say something rather than carry it any longer. "If I buy the Alderman section, the eastern edge of it will border the southeastern corner of your land." He paused. "I'd like there to be a reason for that to be the arrangement for a long time." The cottonwood leaves kept making their papery sound. The creek kept running. Somewhere distant a hawk called, the thin high sound carrying perfectly in the August air. "Dexter," she said. "I'm not asking in the manner of a man who is asking quickly," he said, with great precision. "I'm asking in the manner of a man who has been thinking about this for some months and wants you to know where he stands before he goes further in any direction." She understood what he was telling her. He was not proposing. He was not that far yet, and she respected the honesty of it enormously. He was telling her that if things continued as they were going, he wanted them to continue that way with intention. He was asking her if she wanted that too. "Buy the land," she said. "And yes, that's where I stand." He reached over and took her hand, just held it there on the creek bank with the sun coming through the cottonwood leaves and the heat of the Texas August pressing down on everything. And she laced her fingers through his, and they sat there in the good silence of two people who understand each other. And it was simple and real and better than anything she had planned. The fall of 1882 came with a mercy that was rare for Texas, a gradual cooling that happened over weeks instead of all at once, and the land turned bronze and amber, and the sky came back to its deep blue. Dexter completed his purchase of the Alderman section in September, and Theodora helped him with the paperwork in a way that the land office clerk appeared to find somewhat unprecedented. The woman sitting at the table handling the figures with greater speed than the buyer. But the clerk was a sensible man and said nothing, and the deal was done. Old Pete baked something in celebration. A dense, sweet bread with dried fruit that he presented to Theodora as much as to Dexter, which she understood to mean she had been accepted as a fixture in the Double T's life, and she received this honor with appropriate gravity. The months had changed things in the way that months do when the change is gradual and honest. She and Dexter had moved from the careful distance of new acquaintance through the middle ground of friendship into something that was warmer and more specific than either of those words covered. He held her hand on the porch now, without either of them thinking about it as a notable event. He told her things about the ranch and his days that were not for company, but were for her specifically, the particular texture of his life offered to her, because she was now someone for whom the texture of his life was relevant information. She told him things about her own days with the same ease, the ordinary and the difficult and the funny, and she told him when she was worried about the west pasture's grass coming in sparse, and he came and looked at it with her the next morning, and they decided together on a plan that involved rotating the horses differently and possibly overseeding in spring. Together. That word had crept into their conversation so naturally that Theodora only noticed it one evening in October when they were sitting at her kitchen table going over the spring planting plan, and she heard herself say, "We should probably think about." And Dexter had not blinked, just nodded and said, "The corn will need more water that far west." And she had looked at him across the papers and thought, there it is. In October also came the matter of Cal Donner, which was the first piece of serious unpleasantness that had crossed Theodora's land since she arrived. Donner was a man who had ranched 3 miles to the south, and who had a reputation in Millhaven that was 1 part competence and 2 parts trouble, not violent trouble. The town had enough experience with genuine violence to know the difference, but the low, grinding trouble of a man who believed that what he could take was rightfully his. He rode onto Theodora's property on a Tuesday morning without leave, and began talking to her about the eastern pasture in the manner of someone who is establishing a claim by the simple act of discussing it. He was a broad man in his 40s with a sunburned neck and a smile that told you nothing good, and he told her that Old Man Cutter had given him grazing rights on the eastern pasture in exchange for a debt that had never been settled, and that he expected she would honor that arrangement since the property had come to her from Cutter's estate. Theodora listened to this entire story with her arms crossed and her face very still, which was the face she wore when she was doing several things at once inside her head, and when Donner finished she said, "Mr. Cutter did not own this property when he died. He sold it to my father 11 years ago. Whatever arrangement you made with Mr. Cutter, it was not a legal encumbrance on the title, and I have the title documents. You are welcome to read them." Donner's smile did not change. "That's a mighty firm position for a woman running 40 acres alone." "It's the correct position," Theodora said, "and it has nothing to do with how many acres I have or the fact that I am a woman." He left without incident, but with a manner that suggested the conversation was not over, and Theodora went inside and wrote a letter to the county recorder's office in Abilene asking them to confirm the title history. And then she went to Millhaven and spoke to the lawyer there, a careful man named Hartley, who confirmed what she already knew, which was that Donner had no legal claim, but noted that this kind of thing could become troublesome if Donner decided to be persistent about it. She told Dexter that evening, sitting on her porch, and he listened with his jaw tightening by degrees in a way she had not seen before. "He has no claim," she said. Hartley confirmed it. "I know he has no claim," Dexter said. "The question is whether he respects that." "If he comes back, I'll tell him again," Theodora said. Dexter looked at her. "You'll tell me if he comes back." "I will tell you," she agreed, "and I will also tell him again because I am perfectly capable of—" "I know you are perfectly capable," he said. "I would still like to know." He paused. "Because I would worry, and I would rather not be left to worry when there is something I can do about it." She looked at him and the edge went out of her argument. "All right," she said, "I will tell you." Donner came back twice, and both times Theodora told him the same thing she had told him the first time, with a consistency and specificity that was eventually, she suspected, more wearing than confrontation would have been. And Dexter rode with her to the property line the second time, and his presence said everything that needed to be said without any of it being said aloud, and the third time Donner did not come back. Whether it was Hartley's letter or Dexter's presence, or simply the understanding that Theodora Chandler was the specific kind of resolute that did not wear out, She could not be certain, but the matter was settled, and Theodora filed the confirmation of title in the tin box where she kept her important papers and did not give it further thought. November arrived, and with it the first anniversary of the day she had moved to Millhaven, which she marked privately with a cup of coffee on the porch and a look at the land that was entirely hers, 40 acres of it going golden in the autumn light. She had planted and harvested her kitchen garden. She had gotten 3 of her 5 horses trained to the plow. She had repaired the barn and reinforced the root cellar and learned which sections of the creek were reliable through summer and which ran dry. She had also, in the span of 1 year, done the following: deliberately sabotaged a section of fence, talked a man into dinner, been called confounding, danced with him in a churchyard, spent a summer morning branding cattle on someone else's property, and held his hand by a creek in August until the sun went down. It had been, all things considered, an extremely productive year. On a cold, clear Thursday in November, Dexter asked her to come for dinner at the Double T, which was an occasional thing now, Pete cooking something better than either of them would have managed alone, the 4 of them, sometimes 5 when Carlos stayed, sitting around the rough table in the main room with the fire going, and the conversation the good kind that moves between practical and personal, without anyone having to announce the transition. After dinner, Pete and Carlos cleared the table with a diplomatic efficiency that suggested they had been consulted in advance about something, and Dexter poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table where Theodora was sitting and sat down across from her and set a small object down on the wood between them. It was a ring, not elaborate, a gold band with a small dark red stone, garnet by the look of it, set simply and carefully, the metalwork honest and clean. It was not a ring that was trying to be impressive. It was a ring that knew what it was. Theodora looked at the ring, and then at him, and he was sitting with his hands around his cup and his gray eyes on hers, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all the carefulness down, just him, exactly as he was. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "And I am not asking you this because it's expected of me or because I am being polite. I'm asking you because you are the person I want to talk to every day, and I want to do that with permission to be more than your neighbor." He paused. "Theodora, will you marry me?" She had known this was coming, in the way you know a thing that has been growing toward you for months, and knowing it had not prepared her for the way it felt to be sitting in the warm kitchen of the Double T with the fire in the next room and Pete and Carlos presumably standing in the barn pretending not to be waiting. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger with the focused care he gave to all things that mattered to him, and his hands were warm and steady, and she turned her hand over and looked at the garnet in the firelight and then looked at him across the table. "The fence," she said. "The fence," he confirmed. "I want you to know," she said, "that I had been trying to think of a reason to come over to your place for 2 months before I built the fence." "What stopped you?" he asked. "I had too many reasons," she said. "None of them felt honest enough." He reached across the table and took her hand, ring and all, and held it. "You could have just knocked on the door," he said. "I know," she said. "It seemed too simple." "The fence was simpler," he said, "in the end." "The fence was perfect," she said firmly. He smiled at that, fully and without reservation, and it was the kind of smile she intended to spend the rest of her life being the cause of. They married in December, on a cold, bright Saturday, in the Methodist church at the end of Millhaven's Main Street, with Henderson playing something unrecognizable but heartfelt on the fiddle in the vestibule before the service. Theodora wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made in Galveston before she left, and which she had saved for an occasion that merited it. Her cousin from Houston came for it, a woman named Louisa who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, and whom Theodora had loved unreservedly since childhood. Pete stood as Dexter's witness. Carlos polished his boots for the occasion and wore a suit jacket that fit him nearly perfectly. Amos came and sat in the third pew and said nothing, but he had pressed his shirt and combed his hair, which Theodora understood was the fullest expression of ceremony available to him. Agnes Webb from the post office sat in the front row with her husband and cried from the opening prayer, which she did at every wedding regardless of how well she knew the parties, and which Theodora found entirely charming. The preacher, a thin, earnest man named Marsh who took his work very seriously, performed the ceremony with a gravity appropriate to the occasion, and when he reached the vows, Theodora said them looking directly at Dexter with the directness that was her most fundamental quality, and he said his looking back at her with the steadiness that was his, and when he was given permission to kiss the bride he did, briefly and with great intention, and Agnes Webb made a small sound in the front row. The reception was held in the churchyard, which was habitual, with food enough for everyone who came, and Henderson playing with the tempo irregularity that was also habitual. And Theodora danced with her husband 3 times in a row, and then pulled her cousin into a 4th, because Louisa had come all the way from Houston and had been known to sulk if dancing was withheld. They spent their wedding night at the Double T, which was now Theodora's home as much as it was Dexter's, and she brought with her the things she could not leave behind. Her father's tin box of important papers, her ledger books, the braided rug from the front room of the farmhouse, the Shakespeare she had found on the shelf of the farmhouse that matched the one on Dexter's shelf, the seeds she had been saving for spring. She left the farmhouse itself locked and caretaken, because it was still hers, 40 acres of it, and she intended to use it, intended to expand the kitchen garden and run horses on the east pasture in the spring, and Dexter had already been thinking about how the 2 properties together created a configuration that was, in certain practical ways, more efficient than either alone. Their first year of marriage was the kind of first year that is hard in the ordinary ways, which are not as bad as the extraordinary ways, and good in the fundamental way that mattered most, which was that they were genuinely good for each other and knew it and chose, every day, to act on that knowledge. They argued, because Theodora had opinions and Dexter had convictions, and those were not always the same thing, and their arguments were honest and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they were both people who could not stand leaving things unfinished. They worked the land through the seasons, the Double T and the Chandler 40 both, and the combined operation of the 2 properties took shape in the spring of 1883, with Theodora managing the accounts and the planting calendar and Dexter managing the cattle and the horses, and old Pete managing the kitchen with a sovereign authority that neither of them felt the need to challenge. In the spring of 1883, the creek that ran along the back of both properties ran full and fast from the winter rains, the best creek they had seen since Theodora arrived, and the buffalo grass came in thick across the pastures. Carlos had saved enough from his wages to put money down on a small piece of land south of Millhaven, and Dexter gave him a raise and a handshake, and a recommendation that was 2 pages long, and Carlos left the Double T in the early summer with the handsome self-possession of a young man who is making his own way and knows it. Amos stayed, and a new hand came in June, a quiet man named Ward who was good with horses in the particular manner that suggested the horses had agreed to the arrangement. Agnes Webb intercepted Theodora at the post office in June of 1883 with an expression of suppressed excitement that was immediately interpretable by anyone who knew her. "I have something for you," she said, handing over the regular post and then, separately and with something of a flourish, a catalog from a seed company in Ohio. "You could have just put it in the box," Theodora said. "I wanted to congratulate you," Agnes said. Theodora looked at her for a moment. "Who told you?" "No one told me anything," Agnes said. "Simply observe," she beamed. "Is it in the spring?" "December," Theodora said, since there was no purpose in denying it, "and I would appreciate your discretion." "Of course," Agnes said, and the look on her face suggested that the entire post office would know by Thursday, but it would be said with warmth, and warmth was the currency of Millhaven, and Theodora had come to understand that it was not an unwelcome thing to be known and thought of kindly by the people around you. She told Dexter that evening. She had planned to tell him at dinner, but instead told him the moment he came through the door, which was not planned at all. But the planning went out of her the moment she saw his face. She simply said it, standing in the kitchen, and watched his face change through something she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. Surprise, and then something wordless and full that was not a thing she could have described to anyone accurately. He crossed the kitchen and held her, both arms around her carefully, and she put her face against his chest and heard his heart, and the kitchen was warm and the evening was coming in through the window and everything was exactly as it should be. He said against the top of her head, "A December baby." "The middle of December, I think," she said. "The doctor says the 14th or thereabouts." "In the coldest part of the year," he said. "Texas cold," she said. "Not Virginia cold." She felt him laugh, the low, quiet version of it she loved most. "Fair point," he said. Their son was born on the 17th of December, 1883, in the upstairs bedroom of the Double T Ranch house, with the doctor from Millhaven present and Louisa come up from Houston again, because she had declared early in the pregnancy that she would be there, and she was a woman of her word. The birth was hard in the way first births often are, and Theodora was the kind of woman who got through difficulty by being stubborn at it. And by the morning of the 17th, she was holding a boy with dark hair and gray eyes, and the expression of a person who had arrived and intended to make something of the opportunity. They named him Jonas Dexter Thatcher, for her father and for his, and Dexter sat in the chair beside the bed and held his son with the careful steadiness that was his most fundamental quality, and his face was a thing Theodora stored away precisely, to have for always. Agnes Webb sent a pie. Old Pete made the bread with dried fruit. Amos presented a small carved horse that he had made over the winter, a gray horse, well made, that sat on the windowsill of the nursery for years. The spring of 1884 came with Jonas 3 months old, and already showing signs of having a personality that combined his mother's directness with his father's capacity for observation, which Dexter said was going to be either remarkable or exhausting to live with, and Theodora said it was going to be both. The Chandler 40 acres were producing well. The east pasture had been converted to a training paddock for young horses, and Theodora had developed a sideline in breaking horses for other ranchers in the valley, something she had begun the previous year with 2 horses for a rancher named Ellison, who had been impressed by the result, and sent 3 more the following spring. She had a method, patient and consistent, that produced horses that were reliable and calm rather than merely compliant, and word of this had gotten around in the way that good work always does in places where good work is the main currency that matters. Dexter expanded the herd with the Alderman bottomland, proving exactly as useful as Theodora's calculations had predicted it would be. And the 3rd year came, and the loan was not merely manageable, but was paid in full 8 months ahead of schedule. And Theodora put the final receipt in the tin box with the title documents, and the marriage certificate and Jonas's birth record, and the letter from the county recorder's office about the Donner matter, all the paper evidence of the life they had built, and closed the lid with the satisfaction of a woman who takes pleasure in things being exactly as they ought to be. They had a second child in 1886, a girl they named Sarah Louisa, for Louisa in Houston, who cried when she heard and sent a dress by the next post. Sarah came into the world with auburn hair like her mother's and her father's gray eyes, and a temperament that was sunny in the specific way that makes everyone around it feel the warmth. And Jonas, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with the focused suspicion of a firstborn being asked to share the establishment, and then slowly, over the course of several weeks, came around. And by the time Sarah was 6 months old, Jonas had appointed himself her chief advocate and protector, with a seriousness that Dexter privately found to be the funniest thing he had ever seen. "He's exactly like you," Dexter told Theodora, watching Jonas demonstrate to his infant sister the proper way to hold a fence pliers which he had procured from the workshop and which was almost as large as he was. "He is not at all like me," Theodora said. "He is exactly like you." "He built a fence in the kitchen garden last week," Dexter said, "out of sticks, and then knocked it down and built it again straighter." Theodora pressed her lips together. "That is a perfectly normal thing for a child to do." "He did it wrong the first time on purpose," Dexter said, "and then fixed it." She turned to look at him, and he was looking back at her with that gray-eyed directness that still landed the same way it had landed the first time, no less and maybe more because she knew now everything behind it. "He is exactly like me," she admitted. He laughed, the full version of it, the version she had been the consistent cause of for years now, and she thought as she had thought before that this was one of the finer things in the world, being the reason someone laughed that way. The years went on and the land went on and Millhaven went on, growing by degrees and changing by degrees the way small towns do when the railroad comes close enough to matter, which it did in 1887, a spur line through the valley that changed the speed and scale of everything. Dexter shipped cattle to Abilene by rail now instead of drive, which was a logistical improvement of considerable proportion, and Theodora found a market for the horses she trained at twice the radius she had previously reached, because buyers could come in from further and still make the day's journey practical. Agnes Webb retired from the post office in 1888, and her husband gave a party for her at the hotel, and Theodora and Dexter went and danced. And Henderson was not there because Henderson had died the previous winter at age 66, having played his fiddle at tempo wrong for 40 years, and not once showing any remorse about it. The new fiddle player was a young woman named Clara who played with considerably more conventional timing and somewhat less soul, and Henderson was missed. But the dancing was still good, and they still danced, and Jonas sat at the side of the room watching with his father's eyes and his mother's assessment of the proceedings, and Sarah, who was 2, fell asleep in Pete's arms with a serene confidence in her own comfort that suggested she had inherited the best of everyone. Old Pete retired from the Double T in 1889. He was 63, and his knees had been offering him an increasingly candid assessment of the ranching life for 2 years. And Dexter gave him a cabin on the southeastern corner of the Alderman section, where Pete spent his retirement with a small garden and a dog, and a peaceful satisfaction that he had earned. He came for Sunday dinner every week without fail and contributed advice on the cooking that the new cook, a capable woman named Rosario, accepted with the graceful authority of someone who knows their own work but recognizes experience. Carlos wrote from his land south of Millhaven periodic letters that reported the progress of his operation with a proud precision that made both Theodora and Dexter genuinely glad. He had married a woman named Alina in 1885, and they had 2 children, and his land was doing well, and his letters were the letters of a man who had made the thing he had been working toward. Amos remained, and Ward remained, and in 1890 they hired a new hand, a young man of 20 named Thomas who had come west from Tennessee with the specific ambition of learning ranching from a good outfit, and the Double T was by then known as a good outfit, and Thomas learned fast and well and became, within 2 years, someone Dexter trusted with the kind of responsibility that comes with trust freely given and earned in return. The summer of 1890, Jonas was 6½ and had discovered books with the focused intensity of a child who has found the thing that will matter to him for the rest of his life. He had read everything in the house twice and was making his way through a list of titles that he had compiled himself with a methodical rigor that was recognizably his mother's. He had also, that spring, built a proper fence around the chicken yard with level posts and strung wire, and stood back after to examine it and said, with the satisfaction of someone much older, "That's straight." Dexter had looked at Theodora across the yard and she had looked back at him, and they had both looked at their son examining his fence, and there was between them the specific warm amusement of people who understand a joke that is also a history. "He's going to be all right," Dexter said. "He's going to be more than all right," Theodora said. Sarah, who was 4 and had been watching her brother's fence project with the tolerant interest of a younger sibling who has plans of her own, announced at dinner that she intended to learn to ride next spring, not the pony but the real horses, the ones that had opinions. Dexter agreed to this with the careful face of a father who understood that negotiating with Sarah was a different project than negotiating with Jonah's. And Theodora did not help at all, because she had already privately decided that Sarah would learn to ride whatever she wanted, and the sooner the better. On the evening of their 8th anniversary, December of 1890, Dexter and Theodora sat on the porch of the Double T as they had sat on her porch years ago, in the cold, clear night air of the Texas December, and the stars were enormous and thick overhead, and the land was still and quiet in the winter dark. The children were asleep. The house behind them was warm, the fire banked low, the rooms full of the particular settled feeling of a house that is used and loved and full of people who belong in it. She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the silence that had always been as good as the talking between them. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Theodora said. "Tell me," he said. "The fence," she said. He made a sound that was mostly amusement. "You still think about the fence?" "I think about it fondly," she said. "It was my best work." "It was terrible work," he said. "Those posts were a disgrace." "They were exactly as disgraceful as they needed to be," she said. "Not more, not less." He laughed, the full version in the cold December night, and the sound of it went up into the enormous Texas dark and disappeared, and she felt the warmth of him beside her and the solidness of him. 8 years of him, 8 years of this, and she thought that the thing she had built on purpose to be wrong had been, in the end, the rightest thing she had ever done. "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for coming to fix it." He pulled her closer, pressed his lips to the top of her head, and held her there in the December cold with the stars overhead and the land all around them, all of it theirs, the 40 and the 220 and the alderman 80, the creek running thin in the winter, the horses quiet in the barn, the children asleep, Pete in his cabin, the brass lamp burning in the window, the fence along the north pasture running straight and plumb and true. "I would have found another reason," he said. "Eventually." "I know," she said, "but the fence was faster." In the years that followed, the Double T grew and steadied, and became the kind of operation that younger ranchers looked to as an example of what patient and intelligent work could build from good land and careful management. Theodora kept the accounts and managed the horse training and wrote meticulous letters to the seed companies and the agricultural station that had opened in Abilene in 1888, corresponding with the agronomists there about soil management and grass rotation, with the focused curiosity of a woman who never stopped finding things worth learning. Dexter ran the cattle with the deep and particular knowledge of a man who had grown up watching his father read the land and had grown into a man who could read it himself, and who taught what he knew to Thomas, and to Ward, and eventually to Jonas, who began following his father on the morning rounds with the unspoken intentness of a boy who is learning something he will carry his whole life. Sarah learned to ride in the spring of 1891 on a young mare that Theodora had trained herself, and she rode with a fearlessness that was purely her own, not inherited from anyone, just hers, and she was good at it in the way she was good at everything she decided to apply herself to, which was thoroughly and with great enjoyment. They had a third child in 1893, a boy they named William after Dexter's father, who arrived in the spring with red hair that surprised everyone including his parents, and a set of lungs that suggested opinions about the world that he would not be able to express for some time, but clearly planned to. William was, from his earliest conscious months, a person of intense enthusiasms, which rotated between horses and cooking and eventually, to Pete's great delight, gardening, And by the time William could walk reliably, he was trailing after Pete in the kitchen garden on Sunday visits, with a focused interest that Pete received with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found his successor. Jonas, at 9, accepted his brother with the gravity of a firstborn who understood that the establishment kept expanding. Sarah, at 7, decided William was the best thing that had happened all year, which she expressed by carrying him around whenever she was allowed to, and explaining the ranch to him in thorough detail before he could understand anything she was saying. Millhaven continued to grow. The railroad brought new businesses and new families, and the town acquired a second doctor and a proper schoolhouse, and a newspaper that Agnes Webb, in retirement, contributed occasional columns to about the early history of the area. Theodora read these columns with great enjoyment, and once wrote Agnes a note telling her so, and Agnes appeared at her door 3 days later with a cake, and the suggestion that Theodora might contribute her own memories sometime, which Theodora declined with the firmness of a woman who prefers to keep her history to herself, but appreciated the asking. The winters kept coming and the springs kept following, and the creek rose and fell, and the grass grew and was eaten and grew again, and the cattle were born and grew and were shipped, and the books multiplied on the shelves of the Double T, Jonas adding to them steadily and Sarah contributing her own selections that tended toward the practical and the adventurous, and Dexter read them all eventually, slowly, in the evenings by the fire, with the same patience he applied to everything. On the morning of their 15th anniversary, December of 1897, Dexter came to find Theodora in the workshop behind the barn, where she had been repairing a bridle with the stitching awl and the focused attention of a person who does not like to be interrupted mid-project, and he set a cup of coffee beside her on the workbench and leaned against the bench and watched her work. "You're not going to tell me what you want for our anniversary," he said. "You never do." "I never need anything that I don't get myself," she said, pulling the thread through. "That's not the point of giving a gift," he said. She looked up at him. He was 45 years old, and the gray in his hair had spread and the lines around his eyes had deepened, and he was entirely and completely himself, every year of him present in his face and his bearing, and she thought as she thought regularly that she had looked at this face for 15 years and the looking had not diminished, had in fact only accumulated in the way that good things accumulate. "What do you want?" she asked. "For our anniversary." He considered this with genuine seriousness. "To go for a ride this morning," he said, "out to the creek, like we used to in August years ago." She set the bridle down. "The creek in December." "The cottonwood trees look different in December," he said. "I've been meaning to show you." She looked at him, and there it was still, what had been there from the beginning, the thing she had built a wrong fence for, the thing she had held his hand by the creek for, the thing that had made her say yes in a ranch kitchen with Pete and Carlos standing in the barn pretending to be looking at something else. The thing that had no name adequate to it, that she had been accumulating the evidence of for 15 years and could not have articulated to anyone in language that would have been sufficient, but that she knew as surely and precisely as she knew the line between a post set plumb and one set at a deliberate angle. "All right," she said. "Let me get my coat." They rode out to the creek on a cold December morning, Copperhead's second successor, a steady gray the Double T seemed to produce by some genetic loyalty to type, and Clover's daughter, a bay mare so like her mother that Jonas had taken to calling her second Clover with an irony his parents found charming. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare in December, the leaves gone, the branches making their fine network against the pale winter sky, and the creek ran quietly over the limestone and the whole world was still and silver and clean. They stood beside the horses at the creek bank, and Dexter was right about the cottonwood trees in December. They were different, the bare branches making a kind of lace against the sky that the summer leaves covered, and the winter light came through differently, thinner and more specific. "You were right," she said, "about the trees." "I usually am," he said. She looked at him. "You are absolutely not usually right," she said, with warmth and precision both. You are right approximately 60% of the time, which is better than average but is not usually. 60% is generous, he said, which was the kind of thing he said that she would never fully have predicted when she first met him, this wry, dry, specific humor that was entirely his own. It is generous, she agreed. You are welcome. He took her hand at the creek in December as he had taken it in August 15 years ago, and she looked at the garnet ring on her finger, which she had never taken off for a single day, the stone darker in the winter light, and she thought of the chain of things that had led here. A farmhouse with a leaking roof, and a fence that she had built wrong on purpose, and a gray horse coming over the rise with a man who had been looking for a reason for 4 months. And she thought that the world was, in fact, full of mechanisms by which people who belong together find each other, and that some of those mechanisms were fences, and some of them were patience, and some of them were the willingness to be the one who moves first. Dexter, she said. Yes, he said. I'm going to build another fence in the spring, she said, along the south pasture. He looked at her with those gray eyes, 15 years of gray eyes, every one of them worth having. Are you going to build it straight? He asked. She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and has always known. I haven't decided yet, she said. He laughed, full and warm, into the cold December air, and the cottonwood branches were lace against the pale sky, and the creek ran quietly below them and somewhere on the double T. Jonas was helping Thomas move the winter cattle, and Sarah was in the barn with her horse, and William was probably in Pete's garden despite the cold, and the smoke from the ranch house chimney was going up straight into the still winter air. 15 years of it, and the land was good, and the work was good, and the life they had built together on the open plains of Texas was as plumb and true as a fence set by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and they stood at the creek in the December morning, two people who had found each other by way of a fence that was wrong on purpose, and everything was exactly as right as it needed to be.